Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our Beyond the Basics Strategies to Mature Your Vendor Risk Management Program webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you're not familiar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide those widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of that widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout each session. We will be answering some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to answer all of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during today's presentation. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the live session that will need to be completed in order to receive the CPE credit. With us today, we have Hillary Dewhurst, VendMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy. She will discuss Vendor Risk Management Program maturity and how to get there. You'll see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our How-to Developing and Maintaining Mature Third-Party Risk Management Governance Documentation ebook, How to Report Third-Party Risk Management to the Board Toolkit, Understanding a Vendor Risk Appetite Statement infographic, as well as a link to our Third-Party Risk Management Program Maturity Levels PDF, as well as our library of additional resources, all within the Related Content widget. With all that being said, I would like to hand it back over to Hillary. Hillary, the floor is yours.
Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar on your third-party risk management program maturity. We are going to start out today to just kind of look at what the attributes of a mature vendor risk management program, what are they, what are some steps and actions we can take to drive that maturity, but we're also going to examine how to correctly identify the right issues to improve and kind of overcoming challenges and barriers to do that. We're going to talk about using a program maturity roadmap and measuring and reporting your success. And then we'll wrap up with some key takeaways. So let's just jump on in. All right, so let's assume that you have your vendor risk management or your third-party risk management program in place. And so now it's time to think about how we can make it better or more mature. Now, to begin with, the word mature can be interpreted very broadly. You know, if you research online to see what a mature vendor risk management program looks like, you'll come up with all kinds of different stuff. But let's take a look at some of the common themes. So when we're thinking about mature programs, there's a lot of ways to qualify what is mature, but let's look at some real good indicators of mature programs. So first of all, it's that engagement of the board and senior leadership. They're asking questions, they're analyzing the reports, they're making sure that you have the right resources, and they're holding people accountable. We want to make sure that the senior leadership and the board are also integrating third-party risk management or the consideration of those risks into corporate strategic planning and decision-making. We have good governance structure and documents, and that we have good trained professionals and clearly defined roles throughout the life cycle, so across those stakeholder groups. It's also important that we're integrating with other internal and external data sources, such as risk monitoring and alert, D&B reports, so that we're getting a real fulsome picture of the risk, and that we have third-party risk program metrics and reporting to help everyone understand the health, stability, capacity, and effectiveness of the program. So why do we care about program maturity? Well, first of all, third-party risk or vendor risk is really extended enterprise risk. So we need to make sure that we are managing it, identifying it, assessing it, in the most sophisticated way that we can, because that's part of managing risk. We also need to consider how much money we spend on outsourcing and what portion of our operational budget that accounts for. We don't really want to take that lightly, and so we need to have good mature programs to make sure that we are getting the intended value of those relationships. We also need to make sure that we are maturing our programs because the third-party risk management landscape is constantly changing. And regulatory changes and updates never result in less management. They always require more management. So we need to make sure that our programs are mature and in line with those requirements.
Now, before we go much further in today's presentation, I want to point out and really emphasize that no two third-party risk programs are alike, nor should they be. Your program framework should always reflect and incorporate the risk considerations specific to your company's unique attributes. So, how big is your organization? Are you regulated? What kinds of products and services are provided by your vendors, et cetera? Just keep in mind that on that road to program maturity, there are a lot of different paths to get us there, and no two organizations need to approach program maturity exactly the same. I do want you to remember that program maturity is actually the result of having a mindset of continuous improvement. And I want to talk about that for just a minute. So through this whole session about program maturity, I want you to focus on continuous improvement as the goal first. And this is why. If your goal is continuous improvement, that's always going to give you more objectivity about what's working and what isn't. That's really important because if you're just trying to implement processes or requirements because it will make your program more mature versus improved, you might be missing something. And additionally, when you look at continuous improvement versus just taking steps for maturity, it's going to give you a lot more flexibility with how you address those issues like new risk or regulatory changes. And that continuous improvement objective is going to help you prioritize managing risks versus being stuck in a this is how we do it mindset. And finally, it just really helps you increase effectiveness and efficiencies within the program. Always remember, no matter what, no program is perfect. So always strive for progress and improvement, not perfection. Now, of course, when we're thinking about program maturity, it really helps to understand where you may sit on that spectrum. We've included this chart. It's very basic, and it might vary a little bit from other things you might have seen online, but keep in mind it covers enough of the general information to help you really figure out where your program is. Now, as we walk through this a little bit, don't be too worried about reading and absorbing everything because we've included this maturity matrix as a resource in the related content widget, so you can download it and look at it later. When we start here on the left, we have what initial programs look like, right? There's a lot of ad hoc activity. We don't have a lot of documented processes. Roles and responsibilities probably aren't too defined yet, and we don't necessarily have a lot of involvement from senior management. As we go through developing it, we have good foundational processes that are being, implemented. Rules and requirements are getting more defined. But we still have low organizational awareness. We might have some formal documentation, maybe we have a few procedures or hopefully a policy, but we're just not quite where we need to be. At a minimal level, when we want to start thinking about maturity, we need to be at least in the implemented level where processes are defined, they're repeatable, we have good rules and requirements established, we have a good governance structure, there's enough organizational awareness to make it happen, we've got all that good documentation, and we have that support and ownership from senior leadership. Now, if your program's been around a while, you might be moving into the managed stage because we have really good documentation. And the one hallmark of a managed stage is that we can demonstrate that we're compliant with regulations or requirements. We also have really strong organizational awareness and accountability, and that's really important. We also have strong process discipline and formal governance routines. And if you're lucky and your program's been around a really long time, you might be in the optimizing stage, which means that you're going back and evaluating how you can improve. There are so many details we can include here, but I just wanted you to get a baseline of that spectrum. And if you find that you're falling between two of these categories, that's completely fine. It's just good to know where you're starting. Now, assuming that folks are on this call because they have a program in place, I just want to mention that before you go off and think about your program maturity, that you really make sure that you have your fundamentals mastered first. Now, I'm not going to read these all to you, but some to just point out is that we do need that senior leadership support. We need good criteria for risk rating and identifying critical vendors. We need defined roles and responsibilities, and we need to know the regulatory requirements if we're in that industry. We need to be able to articulate them. Once those components are really settled and you feel confident about them, then you can really start thinking about program maturity. Another really important consideration and component of your program is that it follows the third-party risk management life cycle. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this today, but just as the background, the life cycle was developed with financial regulators. It has now been adopted as best practice for many industries. And just as a quick review, the life cycle has 3 stages: onboarding, ongoing, and offboarding. And each stage, there are specific activities and steps that should follow a prescribed order. So when you want to think about maturity, pull out your third-party risk management lifecycle. Is your program following it? Do you have evidence for each of these steps? Do you have documented processes, etc.? I do want to call out that another important thing is not just that end-to-end activities and steps, but it's also that you have a good foundation of governance in your program, which includes that oversight and accountability, documentation and reporting, and that independent review, which would be your internal audits, your regulatory exams, etc. Now, while you're thinking about the life cycle, I think it is time for our first poll question. Jessie?
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, does your organization follow the third-party risk management lifecycle? Yes, from end to end. Somewhat, not all stages and activities are included. No, or you're not sure. Hillary, it looks like we have some time to answer one of the questions that has come in so far from the audience.
Okay, great. Let's do it.
Is there a formally accepted standard we should apply to measure the maturity of our program?
You know, there's not a formal standard. So in the presentation today, we give you a little bit of a matrix that was pulled from a lot of different, pieces of information. It's, basically your organization is going to measure its progress in a way that makes sense. So, where I'd like to point you to a specific resource, there really isn't one. You can use what we've provided as a good baseline, but make sure that you're really looking at that criteria for maturity and really adjusting it for what makes sense for your organization, because everything's not going to apply across the board. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, everyone, for answering that poll question. Here are those results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before we move on, as a reminder, in the related content widget, you'll find a helpful resource to reference as you mature your third-party risk management governance documents, such as a policy. It's our how-to guide, Developing and Maintaining Mature Third-Party Risk Management Governance Documentation ebook. With that, Hillary, back to you.
So to get started on our program improvement or maturity journey, it's really important to understand that there are basically 8 elements to any third-party risk management program. And we'll go through them individually, but that is your framework, your governance documents, all your processes, your actual governance process, your people, your risk appetite, tools and technology, and reporting. So let's take a look at each one. Now, your framework is the comprehensive collection of all your requirements, all the rules, tools, and processes that make vendor risk management possible at your organization. If you're a regulated industry, the framework should always reflect regulatory requirements and best practices. Now, because we're talking about the whole program essentially, individual components, the ones we mentioned on the previous slide, are going to help drive program maturity. But as a whole, mature frameworks have the following attributes. They have defined rules and requirements that are memorialized in our governance documents, clear roles and responsibilities, documented and tested processes, established oversight and governance, defined risk appetite and tolerance levels, effective tools and technology, and comprehensive reporting. Governance documents are a very important element of any third-party risk management program, and these are the documents that formalize all of the rules and requirements. While auditors and regulators will only require you to have a formal policy, it's also recommended that you have a program document which explains the processes used to meet those requirements and sets of stakeholder procedures that can help execute those processes. Now, when it comes to having mature documentation, it's not about having the oldest or the longest documents. But instead, it's about having practical requirements, guidelines, and rules that are reflective of what you're actually doing. So we never want these documents to be aspirational or what we want to do someday. It should be reflective of what we're doing right now. And speaking of being reflective, they should include references to and rules about the requirements that you're trying to meet for regulatory purposes and best practices. They should be approved by your board or that most senior level of management, and most importantly, they're accessible to everyone that can benefit from them. Our processes, of course, are the actions we take to achieve compliance to the rules and requirements listed in the policy. We want to make sure that our processes directly reflect the actions and steps in the right order listed on the vendor risk management lifecycle. Now, in the spirit of continuous improvement, you're probably going to review and reevaluate and tweak your processes on a continual basis. And that's fine. As a matter of fact, that is preferred. But how do we know our processes are mature? Well, first and foremost, processes have a direct relationship to the policy rules and requirements. And we're conducting those steps and activities so that we can comply with those requirements, and we know that we have clear objectives and desired outcomes for those processes. For example, when we go through the process of conducting an inherent risk assessment, our objective is to identify the types and amounts of risk present in the engagement, to assign a risk rating, and to use that information to scope our due diligence and set the management and monitoring routines that we're going to need for that vendor throughout its lifetime. Mature processes have documented workflows, they identify the rules and responsibilities for each stakeholder in the process, and they have clearly identified outputs, decisions, or approvals. And finally, they're tested periodically to make sure that they're meeting the requirements and that they're in line with our objectives. Well, we know that governance is essential for any third-party risk management program, and what are those hallmarks that we're looking for in governance that would be found in a mature program? Well, first of all, that policy approval from the highest level of the organization. We want to make sure that the board has a lot of visibility, that they're getting good third-party risk management reporting. We need really strong and consistent involvement from senior leadership. So not just approval, but they're involved. We want executive ownership at the enterprise level as well. So somebody at that C level, so your CFO, CTO, CCO, have ownership of the program. We also need defined escalation paths for issue management and resolution. So we are tracking reporting issues and that we know that they get managed. We have regular internal audits and that we have those program metrics, because those program metrics are going to help us measure the health, stability, capacity, and compliance of the program. And furthermore, third-party risk management needs a seat at the enterprise risk management committee table, or they need their own governance committee, but we need to be part of the bigger risk management picture throughout the organization. So let's talk a moment about people as a component in your program. More than any other element, people are the wild card, because it's just not possible to capture all the personalities, the experience levels, the priorities, the motivations and behaviors into a neat little box or simple calculation. Because, you know, if people are the doers, they can be the undoers just as easily. So I want to talk about people and focus on a few elements here. First of all, clearly defined roles and responsibilities are completely essential, as is the commitment from the people in those roles to fulfill their duties. But that means we also have to have good training and education so that they can do that effectively. We also need to give them a feedback mechanism so that they can help us understand, as third-party risk management program managers and team members, what's working and what isn't. But I do want to focus on one thing here, and that is that all individuals who have responsibility for third-party risk management in any shape or form should have performance metrics on their performance plan related to that. Now, I want to give you an example. Let's think about that difficult first-line vendor owner. We all have them. I know you have that person in your mind right now. You know, they could be the worst vendor owner in the world. They can be late on every third-party risk management deliverable. They can just ignore the process and still enjoy a raise or a bonus if all their other performance is up to par. But let's take the first-line vendor owner who maybe has a critical vendor and spends a good amount of time on third-party risk management activities, but they're not recognized or compensated for that work. Will that continue to be a priority for them? So this is why I think it's really important as part of your program development to work with your HR team and your leadership to implement those KPIs for performance plans for individuals with responsibilities around third-party risk management. The other thing that's really important is that there is an experienced and skilled person leading the third-party risk management program. It just really shouldn't be anyone, because it is not just a simple practice. It requires a lot of understanding, intelligence, experience, and skill. And then finally, with the people element in mature programs, collaboration is the expected norm when there is a problem to be solved.
Another tricky component of third-party risk management teams is that risk appetite. And we get a lot of questions about that and what it really means and how it plays a role within your vendor risk management program. So basically, to effectively manage risk, we need to know the tolerance for that risk or the thresholds that that risk cannot exceed. And truthfully, this would be very unusual for just a vendor risk management team or program to establish that risk appetite on its own. So when it comes to developing a risk appetite, it's not just those thresholds, but it's the behaviors that help manage risk. And first of all, there needs to be a defined risk management structure across the organization for the whole enterprise. In the best case scenario, you're also going to have those documented risk thresholds and approval levels to take those risks. You'll need an established risk committee and organizational awareness and ownership of vendor risk. And it's not just something that only the vendor risk management team thinks about, but all the stakeholders in the organization who have interaction or responsibility for vendors, that they're actually aware and vigilant about those risks also. Our mature risk management structure also has something called a credible review and challenge, which means that risk decisions are never made in a vacuum. And finally, one of the most important hallmarks is to make sure that the organizational risk appetite demonstrates that compliance with the policy is expected and is the business norm. So tools are a very important part of our third-party risk management programs, and they can certainly make our program more mature, provided it's the right tool for the purpose. I want to draw a distinction here between tools and technology, which I'll cover in just a bit, because your tools are basically enabled through technology. And your tools are all the mechanisms for identifying and measuring risk, collecting data, communicating with your stakeholders, and managing issues. Reporting can also be considered a tool, but we'll get into that later in the presentation. I want to just point out a few things, a few aspects of mature tools. There's a lot on here, but one important aspect of our tools, especially any risk assessment or vendor risk questionnaire, those really should be created and reviewed and updated in collaboration with subject matter experts. This isn't really a time to do your best guess, and we really want to lean on the professional expertise to help us identify the right risk attributes. We also want to make sure that the methodology for our risk ratings is documented and tested, as well as the criteria for critical vendors should be documented. We want to make sure that our contracts for critical and high-risk vendors contain standardized terms and conditions. So that might be right to audit, information security breach notification, employee training, etc. We need a good issue management and escalation process that should be documented, and we should be able to show that issues are reported and tracked. We want to define our communication channels, not just to our vendors, but to our stakeholders as well. Do we communicate through email or through a Teams chat? We need to make sure that that's established and standardized so people know where to look for the information. And then finally, with any tool, when there's changes, they really should follow an established change management process. So technology is an enabler of our tools, like I mentioned before. We want to really make sure that wherever possible that we're using automation and moving away from manual processes, because honestly, they take a lot of administrative effort. They're time consuming and they're also very error prone. So when it comes to your technology, specifically your technology that you're going to use to support your program, like your third-party risk management system, you want to make sure that it has easy configuration, that's getting updated regularly, that it really does provide the right document management and storage and organization. We want to automate those workflows and reporting, that there's communication tools at least to your vendors within the tool, and it should also your vendor owner at a bare minimum. And it's really important that it has the ability to connect to other data sources like your accounts payable through API or other means. Just like reporting is part of your governance foundation, it's also an essential element of an effective vendor risk management program. And because reporting is meant to provide information, drive action, and confirm compliance, availability of reports, both standardized and ad hoc, are required. So let's take a look at that. So mature programs can produce a variety of standardized and ad hoc reports. There's just a few I want to call out from this list. Issues management and tracking is essential. Your board report for senior management, those are super important, and they are a regulatory requirement. But another one I want to bring to your attention is a report that details which components of PII, or that confidential or sensitive information, that your vendors are capturing. So for example, I need to know if a vendor is capturing social security and address, telephone number, date of birth, account balance, passwords, etc. This can be invaluable in the event of a data breach or some kind of systemic outage, and creating that report, capturing that data, and being able to report it is essential. Another one that's really important is vendor performance reports. Especially for critical vendors, we want to know how they're doing. Are they meeting the terms of their contract? Have there been any issues, etc.? Now, while you think about reports, I think we are up to our next poll. Jessie?
Our second poll question of the day is, which of these vendor risk, third-party risk management program elements has been your biggest challenge? Support from senior leadership and the board? Consistent participation and compliance from the line of business? Managing workload? Two or more of the above? None of the above? Or you're not sure? Hillary, I have another question here that we could go ahead and answer.
Okay.
Great. Do regulators have any requirements about continuous improvement or program maturity?
That's kind of a tricky question. So as I understand it, and I've read all these regulations, there's no specific requirement. The requirement that regulators have about your program is that it meets the standards as outlined in the guidelines. However, let's say you have a regulatory exam and your program's relatively new, it's immature, your regulator might make some suggestions for improvement. Now, if they come back in for another exam a year or so later and you haven't done anything, that would result in a finding or possibly an enforcement action, depending on how serious it is. So, their expectation is that you are going to meet the requirements. They also understand that all programs are not created equally. So my best advice here is when you can't meet a requirement, just put in a note or document how you are going to meet it in the future. That would be the best way to solve that problem from a regulatory standpoint.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. I would like to quickly direct your attention to the related content widget where you will find our Understanding a Vendor Risk Appetite Statement infographic. As we discussed risk appetite a couple slides ago, we felt this infographic may be a helpful resource. Okay, Hillary, let's continue with the presentation.
Okay, we have covered a lot of information about attributes of mature programs, sort of broken down into the individual elements. But let's make this meaningful for you. So I want you to take just a minute to think about your own program. To really think about where you have the most friction or the biggest challenges. So if you could wave a magic wand, what is the one thing you would change and why? Okay, did you think about it? Great. So for many of us, maturing your program is not really about adding on a bunch of additional processes and reports. It's really about fixing the things that aren't really working as intended. So we're going to walk you through some information that can helpfully get you on the road to addressing those challenges. Now we're going to start with a very common situation. We know this is common. We hear it all the time in our surveys. It's about engagement from the first line. And we're going to use this example. So Clara is a third-party risk manager for her company, and she's done a lot of work getting this program up and running, but she's still running into a lot of resistance and sometimes even a pointed refusal from the first-line vendor owners to get on board and follow the processes. We've all been there at some point, right? So, of course, this is wearing her down because, like most of us, she doesn't have enough resources to get all of her work done, and now the first line isn't doing theirs. So she's spending a lot of time following up. She's sending reminders, and most recently, she's had to deal with a confrontational first-line owner. So she's kind of at the end of her patience, and she decides it's time to engage the business line manager to drive enforcement to the policy. So she's thinking, I'm going to just go to that manager and they can deal with it. Well, Clara went in and she spoke to that manager, but guess what? She wasn't quite ready to jump in to help her. Why? Because it wasn't clear what the root cause of the issue actually was. And we're bringing this up because knowing and identifying root causes is incredibly important when we're trying to solve a problem. So Clara got some valuable feedback, but she also got a commitment from the manager to help her identify the root cause of the issue. When you're trying to fix a problem in your program, you have to go beyond that surface and really look at the possible root causes. In this case, in Clara's case, we're looking at noncompliance to the program. So when the business line manager solicited feedback from his team, the rationale they provided clearly indicated there were deeper issues to consider. Now, there is a best practice I'd like to suggest that you keep in mind during these types of exercises, and that is to always assume that people have good intentions, meaning that most people you encounter really do not want to be difficult for the sake of being difficult, although I know we have a few of those running around. Feedback in the form of criticism and frustration is usually a symptom, but it's not the cause of an issue. Now, let's take a look at how this works. So the manager asked, "Why aren't you complying?" And here's some of the rationale he got. It seems like overkill, or why do we have to do this? Well, the root cause there might be that they have insufficient understanding of the risk. Another one was, "I don't really know how to do it. It's too confusing." Well, the root cause there may be non-effective or non-existent procedures and training. The last one is, "I have other priorities. Basically, this is not my job." And one of the root causes there would be leadership messaging and enforcement. So now that we've teased out some root causes, we have some possible actions that can enable a positive outcome. So, insufficient risk understanding, maybe they need more training and stronger messaging from their frontline managers. Maybe we need to provide some better education and training and rewrite our procedures so they're easier to understand and follow. And maybe we need better risk messaging, get that tone from the top. Now, this one's incredibly important. As an example, I'm proud to say I worked for Bank of America for many years, and during my time there, they had an internal mantra that was essentially managing risk is everyone's business. It was very powerful. I remember it even to this day. So, why I'm bringing this up is like everything seems so easy, right? We have our actions, but some of these might be easier than others to implement, right? It's not always easy to fix that tone from the top. You can't control what senior management is doing, but there are a lot of other actions we can always take to address the problems. And that's why I want to talk about how to prioritize your solutions. When you think about who and what you can control, it is important because when you consider the program improvements you'd like to make or the stakeholder behaviors you'd like to change, the easiest issues to improve are the ones where you have ownership. Where you don't have ownership, you must be able to either influence or collaborate. Now, this chart may not align precisely to your organization or your business culture, but in general, if you're running your third-party risk management program, you should have full ownership over the policy, the program framework, all the reporting, and the procedures and training supporting that program. However, when it comes to governance and the risk appetite, you might only be able to influence those decisions by providing data and the right information that can hopefully drive the decision to result in a better outcome. Now, we can't manage other people's policies or metrics, but maybe we can influence them. And finally, there will be plenty of opportunities for you to be a collaborator. You can work with other stakeholders to figure out how tools and technology will work and how reporting will look or how to measure compliance. The truth is, it's always easiest to change when you have ownership. And the reality is we don't always have ownership, so we have to be intentional influencers and collaborators. That is why when you're working on your plan to drive maturity, always prioritize what you have direct ownership over first, and then think about where you can influence and collaborate. Now let's talk about putting together that maturity roadmap. Now, if you're wondering if you really need a maturity roadmap or why you would want one, just keep in mind that it is a snapshot of where the program is, the activities you need to undertake to get from point A to point B. It can really help educate your stakeholders and identify any dependencies that are going to affect your efforts. It really is providing that big picture in a condensed view, and it can be very, very helpful when using it to ask for support from leadership, the business units, etc. Now, we did show this slide earlier in the presentation, and we went through the different levels of maturity. So we're not going to go back and rehash that, but I'm bringing this back up to show you how you might use a maturity matrix like this as part of putting together your roadmap. Now, one thing I really like here is that it's color-coded, and if you've attended my webinars in the past, you know I like to present data visually whenever possible. And color-coding your maturity map can be very helpful in explaining where we are in the process. So let's look at an actual maturity roadmap. All right, so this is an example of a third-party maturity roadmap. It is so basic. You could do this in Excel or PowerPoint or Word, whatever works for you. It's essentially a grid. Now we're listing the program components down the side on the left, and we're the time increments that we're managing across the page. We've also used a color coding system to help people understand where each program component is at any one time and that progression of moving it from one state to another. We've placed a few action items here to represent the activities or projects that we need to complete before we can move into a more mature status. And you know what? These are all just placeholders. You can put whatever you want on here. This just illustrates sort of the level of detail and what we want to be showing our stakeholders. Now you might be thinking, okay, this looks really pretty, but why do we actually need this tool? Well, there are a couple of reasons, but the leading one is that there's so much that goes on in third-party risk management. There's so many processes, stakeholders, all those program components. It's pretty much totally unlikely that anyone but the third-party risk management team is going to understand them all or be able to recall them all at any point. But it's also important to help your senior management and your board and even your other stakeholders understand where you are in the process and what steps that you're taking to move from implemented to optimizing. Now, I'm going to tell you this because I've been in this situation where we brought on, say, a vendor risk management system, and everybody was so focused on that, and there was a lot of commotion around that activity, and actually a pretty good budget to get it done. But now, fast forward another year, and we had to ask for some budget dollars specific for training and development through a self-serve training platform. You know, the finance manager came back and says, no, because didn't we just implement that big system last year? Well, we did, but that was only part of what we needed to accomplish to get the whole program to a managed state. So for somebody who was not directly involved in vendor risk management, they really had no idea about all the components and all the levers we need to pull just to make the process work efficiently. So that is one of the reasons that I recommend this tool. Your roadmap can be part of your reporting for the board, and it can be part of your annual budget request. It can also show your auditors or examiners that you know exactly what needs to occur to get you to the next state or to close an issue. But most of all, it can help you identify where you might have dependencies for items that need to be fixed before you can move on to something else. Your maturity roadmap should be part of your annual update to the board at least, any budget requests, and part of the regular discussions that you have with your senior management. So when you've done all this hard work to implement these changes and improve your program, we just don't want to show someone a roadmap about what we did or what we're going to do. Let's talk about how it's going. What challenges do we have? You know, what successes do we have? So reporting is an important component of that. So first of all, we want to provide a full review of the program, the roadmap, metrics, and other key reporting for the board and senior management at least once a year. We want to provide a progress report against the roadmap at least twice a year, and we want to develop and implement those program metrics and report on them quarterly. We also need to provide reporting for stakeholders that are engaged in that program improvement effort, right? It's really important to acknowledge those efforts and to say thank you. Beyond reporting on your program maturity efforts, reporting in general is a tremendous tool to drive maturity. So I just want to touch on that for a minute. First of all, consistency in your metrics and format are really important. But the thing that's most important in reporting is what purpose does it serve and who's the audience. So I've put together this little chart that can help you kind of understand who should get what types of reports how often. So on a monthly basis, we're really doing these kind of reports to drive action or provide information. And this would include things that are actionable now or need intervention or someone needs to know right away. On those quarterly reports, these are for the risk committees, and they're about information, action, but also planning. So we want to give them that dashboard. We want to help them understand what we're doing next. We want to show the progress against goals and objectives. And we also want to talk about any internal compliance, regulatory changes, or process changes. And then annually, we want to do that full state of the program report for the board that we talked about a little bit earlier. Okay, let's talk about those real steps we can all take to mature our program. The first one is always review your program fundamentals against that life cycle, any regulatory requirements and best practices. If there are any gaps or weaknesses, you're going to want to document them. And you're going to need to determine where you have that ownership, that influence, or the need to collaborate. So, what's it going to take to get it fixed? We also want to think about any dependencies. Is there a specific order we need to follow? Do we need additional resources? And what is a reasonable time for action? We'll also want to establish which of those items we're going to work on first. So anything that affects regulatory compliance, you definitely want to put that at the top of the list. Probably then followed by processes that are ineffective. They're not doing their job, then inefficient. Maybe they're taking longer or more steps than you'd like. Always investigate your root causes and really think through and identify the specific actions and projects, the roles and responsibilities, the decisions and approvals that will be needed in that process. And then finally, outline your improvements or your program maturity roadmap and present that to your stakeholders. Now, with that, we have our last poll of the day. Jessie?
Our next poll question is, overall, our vendor risk and third-party risk management program maturity level is in the initial stage, in the developing stage, in the implemented stage, in the managed stage, optimizing stage, or not sure. Hillary, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience.
All right.
And that question is, we don't have a documented risk appetite statement for vendor risk management. How do we develop one?
Oh, that's a great question because a lot of vendor risk management programs don't have their own individual risk appetite statement. So the first thing you should do is, work with your risk committee or your enterprise risk management team, whoever is responsible for your organizational risk. I'd really inquire if there is a risk appetite statement for the organization. Many of these may look like a matrices where it will say, financial risk between this dollar amount and this dollar amount at escalating levels. And a lot of those different levels have different actions associated with it, like requiring sign-off from this level of management, et cetera. So I'd really start with your risk person or committee, ask to see the organizational risk appetite, look at how it's structured, and then you'll want to collaborate with them on how to apply that same structure to vendor risk management. Now, this is not going to be the same for every company for sure, but I would always make sure you're leveraging what is in place because third-party risk management is part of your organizational risk, and the way you're measuring it and driving that risk appetite should be reflective of the general risk appetite. So that would be my recommendation, to start there and ask your questions for them because they are going to help you develop the right information specific to vendor risk management.
Here are those results. Thank you to everyone for answering this question. It's always interesting to see what everyone says. Also, I'd like to mention that you'll find our How to Report Third-Party Risk Management to the Board toolkit. Within the toolkit, you'll find an infographic and a Word and PowerPoint template that discuss reporting to your board. Hillary, I will pass it back to you.
So there are a couple derailers that may be existing in your program now, or these are things to avoid as you go forward. I'm not going to read them all, but I do want to call out a few. And one of the first one is just building your program to standards that don't apply to your industry or your organization. This happens all the time. You really need to right-size it and scale it appropriately. Another one is expecting adherence to complex procedures or requirements without any education or training. We've got to let the stakeholders know how to fulfill their roles effectively. We also need to make sure that they're able to give us feedback about the program, because sometimes they see things we don't, and it can be very useful. And then finally, we need to be integrated with other risk functions, teams, and committees to really make it successful. Okay, your key takeaways for today. Focus on the fundamentals first, right? Build and mature your program to what your organization needs and what is required, right? Don't overbuild. Don't overscale. If it's not appropriate for your company, don't try and make everyone do it. Focus on improvement versus optimization, progress over perfection. Really think about those root causes. You know, that is going to change everything in the way if you're successful or not, if you can correctly identify the root cause. Keep your actions doable, processes simple, and rules enforceable. Make sure you're leveraging your ownership and using reporting to drive influence, support problem solving, and validate program necessities. And then finally, always stay informed from a regulatory perspective. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jessie for some final words and some Q&A. Jessie?
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Hillary for her time in sharing some really important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On March 30th, our vendor financial red flags your credit union should watch for. And on April 4th, our fourth party risk, what to know and how to manage it. We hope you will be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Hillary, the next question is, what are some of the better KRIs to include in senior management and or board reporting?
So when we're talking about our third-party risk management programs, you know, we need the board to understand kind of four key areas. One is the program performing as it's intended? One of the things that we're trying to do in a lot of cases is meet regulatory compliance. So we want to identify KPIs and KRIs relative to regulatory compliance. So are we performing due diligence and risk reviews on time? You know, are we meeting the requirement to fully risk assess our vendors before we enter a contract, for example? We also want those KPIs to reflect the health of the program. So, you know, do we have good internal compliance? Are we following our own processes regularly, or do we have a lot of exceptions? Another one would be the capacity. Do we have the right amount of resources to actually manage our workload and identify and manage that risk correctly? So some of those KPIs could be, again, you know, how frequently we're doing those risk reviews. Are they happening on time? How well issues are managed? And then finally, we want our board to understand, you know, just what the general health of the program is. So what are the areas that we're struggling in? Where do we need to put more focus? There's so much more I could include, but hopefully that will give you just a general idea.
Great. Our next question, excuse me. Where do you see the third-party risk management reside within organizations? Have you seen a trend of this function falling within responsibility of information security?
We get asked all the time about where third-party risk management should live, and it really is dependent on your organization. There's so many variables here. Generally, the optimal place I personally like to see third-party risk management have alignment to is within that enterprise risk management structure. So that in and of itself may not be a full division. That may sit under your CFO or your compliance department, but we've got to understand that third-party risk management is extended enterprise risk management, right? Because we're spending all this money on these vendors. We're so dependent on them. But sometimes alignments under, say, IT, some of that focus can be diluted because then the tendency is like we're just going to focus on maybe cybersecurity and information security protection. That's not to say it can't happen well. I've seen organizations that do that very well, but optimally it should align with the same team or organization as enterprise risk.
Perfect. Next question. How do you separate the criticality of a vendor from the residual risk rating of a vendor? I believe these are separate. Our platform newly used feel these are the same thing.
Okay, that to me is a little confusing. So first of all, your criticality will never change. Your criticality is something you should establish up front. Is this vendor, this product, this service going to be necessary for our operations or for our customers, right? Not necessary, but critical, right? If they fail or go out of business, we have big problems. Residual risk, on the other hand, should be sort of a calculation or an estimation of how effective your controls are or how confident you are in those controls. So your inherent risk, which is different than your criticality, right? Everything's critical or non-critical. Inherent risk is, we have high, low, or medium risk. That can change after you apply your controls, but they definitely should be separate. So I might go back and touch base with the providers and maybe get some more information just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. It could be, just a miscommunication or a functionality issue, I'm not sure, but criticality and residual risk should not be linked.
Great. Next question. What kind of information should be reported to the board?
Again, so the board needs to understand how the program's working, but they also need to really have a good idea about who the critical vendors are, how those critical vendors are performing, if there's any issues. They need to know if there's any major program changes, if there's, say, a pending regulatory change, how we're preparing to deal with that. They also should be able to understand, what you're doing with your program overall, how that maturity roadmap, how we're going to get from point A to point B. Are there any areas of focus that we need? Maybe our capacity is low. So generally, you want to give them the sort of the full spectrum picture, but really focus on the things that they can drive action on or influence your senior leadership to help you make changes.
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you, Hillary, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. A big thank you to Hillary for her time and great content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics to assist you. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request a CPE credit. On behalf of VenMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.